All right, let's rewind the clock. Not just a couple centuries, we're going way back, before skylines, before the United States was even a thought, to a cold, rain-soaked island sitting off the edge of Europe, a place that, on paper, had no business becoming the most dominant empire in human history. And that's what makes this story so wild. Because the British Empire didn't begin with power. It began with pressure, survival pressure. Back in the early 1500s, England wasn't leading anything. It wasn't feared. It wasn't dominant. It wasn't even in the top tier. Spain, that was the giant, pulling insane amounts of gold and silver out of the Americas. Portugal, running the global trade game like a machine from Africa to Asia. France, strong, wealthy, and constantly in the mix. And England, it was trying to stay relevant, playing defense, watching from the sidelines. But then something changes, not overnight, not by accident. A slow shift fueled by ambition, desperation, and just enough luck to matter. Because here's the edge England had: it was late. And being late, that meant it got to study the winners. They watched Spain flood Europe with New World wealth. They watched Portugal lock down trade routes like it owned the planet. And they started connecting the dots. Power wasn't just about land anymore. It was about movement, access, control of the oceans. And once that realization hit, England didn't hesitate. It pivoted hard. Instead of looking inward, dealing with internal politics and survival, it turned outward, toward opportunity, toward expansion, toward risk. And then came the moment that changed everything. 1588, the Spanish Armada. This wasn't just another naval clash. This was supposed to be the end of England. Spain sent a massive fleet to invade, dominate, and shut England down for good. On paper, England didn't stand a chance, but reality, different story. England's ships were smaller, faster, their tactics smarter, more flexible, and when it mattered most, they outmaneuvered the most powerful navy in the world. Spain loses. And just like that, the balance shifts. England isn't just hanging on anymore. It's stepping into the arena, and from here, things start moving fast, real fast. England begins establishing colonies across the Atlantic. 1607 Jamestown, it's rough, brutal even, starvation, disease, internal conflict. At times it almost collapses completely, but it doesn't, and that's the key, because survival turns into stability, and stability turns into expansion. More settlements, more people, more control. And then trade enters the picture. This is where things level up and get complicated. Enter the British East India Company. Now don't think of this as just a company. This was something else entirely. A business with power, a business with influence, a business with its own army. Yeah, let that sit for a second. They arrive in India under the label of trade, spices, textiles, wealth. But slowly trade becomes leverage. Leverage becomes control, and control, that turns into domination. At the same time, across the Atlantic, Britain's American colonies are growing fast, population rising, land expanding, influence spreading. By the early 1700s, Britain isn't catching up anymore. It's competing head-to-head with the biggest powers on Earth. And then comes France. Rivalry turns into conflict. Conflict turns into global war, what we now call the 7 Years' War. That was global before global war was even a term. Fought across Europe, North America, India, and the oceans connecting them. And when it ends in 1763, Britain wins, decisively. France loses major territory. Britain gains Canada, tightens its grip on India, and locks in its position as a global powerhouse. At this point, the British Empire isn't just forming anymore. It's expanding, fast, aggressive, unstoppable. But here's where the story flips. Because right at the moment Britain is rising on the world stage, it's about to lose something massive. In North America, tension is building, and it's about to break. Because in North America, that tension, it finally snaps, the American Revolution. From Britain's point of view, this wasn't just unexpected, it was unthinkable. These weren't distant strangers. These were their colonies, their system. their extension of power across the Atlantic. But from the American side, different story. This was about control, about taxation without representation, about a growing realization that being governed from 3,000 miles away just didn't make sense anymore. So when fighting breaks out in 1775, Britain assumes it'll be quick. A show of force, a reset, done. It wasn't. The war drags on, costs rise, resistance stiffens, and then France steps in. Yeah, France, Britain's longtime rival, now backing the rebellion. And that changes everything. By 1783, the outcome is locked in. America wins its independence. And just like that, Britain loses 13 colonies. On paper, that should have been catastrophic. The kind of loss that ends empires before they even fully form. But here's where Britain flips the script. It doesn't collapse, it adapts. Instead of pulling back, it recalibrates. Focus shifts east. Hard, India moves from opportunity to priority. What began as trade through the East India Company starts evolving into something much bigger. More control, more influence, more authority. And then comes 1857, the Indian Rebellion, a massive, violent uprising against British rule, one that shakes the entire system. And Britain responds decisively. The East India Company is stripped of power. No more middleman. Now the British crown takes direct control. India becomes the jewel in the crown. And this wasn't just symbolic. India meant resources, raw materials feeding British industry. It meant manpower, millions of people under imperial structure. And strategically, it connected Britain to Asia in a way no other territory could. At the same time, something else is accelerating: the Industrial Revolution. And this changes everything. Factories scale up production like never before. Steam engines transform transportation. Railroads reshape movement of goods, people, power. Britain becomes the workshop of the world. But with that dominance comes a new kind of dependency. Industry needs input, raw materials in, finished goods out. And to keep that machine running, you need reach, global reach. So Britain builds it. Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, the Middle East. Everywhere you look, there's British presence. Sometimes it's direct rule. Sometimes it's economic control. Sometimes it's military pressure. Let's be clear, this expansion wasn't clean. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't equal. And it definitely wasn't fair, but it worked. By the late 1800s, the British Empire hits its peak. We're talking about something massive, unmatched in scale. An empire so vast that the phrase, "the sun never sets on it," wasn't just a line, it was reality. At any given moment, somewhere on Earth, the sun was shining on British territory. From Canada to India to Australia to huge parts of Africa, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land, and about the same share of its population. That's not influence. That's total dominance. And holding it all together, the Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force on the planet. It secured trade routes, projected military strength, and kept the empire connected across thousands of miles of ocean. But here's the truth about empires: the bigger they grow, the more pressure they carry. And beneath all that dominance, cracks were forming. Economic strain, resistance across colonies, new powers rising, watching, waiting. And then the 20th century arrives, and everything starts changing fast. And then the 20th century arrives, and the world, it stops playing by Britain's rules, because now it's not just about empires anymore. It's about industrial power, global alliances, and total war. World War I 1914. And Britain is pulled into a conflict that's unlike anything humanity has ever seen. This isn't some distant colonial skirmish. This is trenches, machine guns, chemical weapons, mass destruction on a scale no one was ready for. And yes, Britain wins. But here's the catch: victory comes at a cost. A massive one. Millions dead, economy drained, resources stretched to the limit. And for the first time, the empire starts to feel heavy. Like it's carrying more than it can handle. But it gets worse. Because not long after, World War II hits. And this one, even more brutal. Britain is bombed relentlessly during the Blitz. Cities burn, civilians suffer, infrastructure collapses. And while Britain again ends up on the winning side, the illusion of invincibility, gone, completely gone. Because now two new superpowers emerge from the ashes, the United States and the Soviet Union. And Britain, it's no longer at the top. Now it's trying to keep up. At the same time, something else is happening. Across the empire, voices are getting louder. India, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. People who had been ruled for generations are now asking a very simple question. Why not us? Why shouldn't we govern ourselves? Why should decisions be made thousands of miles away? And Britain, exhausted, financially strained, and under global pressure, doesn't have a strong answer anymore. So the empire begins to unravel, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. In 1947, India gains independence. And this is huge, because when the jewel in the crown is gone, the crown doesn't shine the same way anymore. And it doesn't stop there. Over the next few decades, colony after colony breaks away. Pakistan, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Malaysia. The list keeps growing, and each one marks another step in the end of empire. Now, to be clear, this isn't always smooth. There's conflict, violence, tension. Decolonization is messy, but it's unstoppable because the world has changed. Empires are out, nations are in, and Britain, it has to redefine itself. No longer as a global ruler, but as a global partner. By the late 20th century, the British Empire as it once existed is gone. In its place, the Commonwealth, a network of independent nations, many of them former colonies, that still maintain cultural and political ties with Britain. It's not control, it's connection, and it's a completely different kind of influence. But here's the real question: was the British Empire a force for progress, or a system built on exploitation? Because the truth, it's both. It spread language, legal systems, infrastructure, ideas that still shape the modern world. But it also brought inequality, extraction, and deep scars that haven't fully healed. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It's not black and white. It's complicated. It's human. And maybe that's the biggest lesson here: no empire lasts forever. No matter how powerful, no matter how global, because history, it doesn't stand still, it moves. And the British Empire, for all its dominance, was just one chapter. A massive one, but still just a chapter. And here's where the story gets even more interesting. Because when most people think about the British Empire, they picture maps painted red, colonies scattered across continents, soldiers in formation, ships cutting through endless ocean. But that's only half the story. The real legacy of the British Empire, it didn't end when the empire ended. It's still here, right now. Look around. The English language, it didn't just spread, it took over. From the United States to India, from Nigeria to Australia, English became the default setting for global communication. Business, aviation, diplomacy, the internet, entire systems run on a language that started on a small island in Europe. That wasn't random. That was empire. And it goes deeper. Legal systems. A huge number of countries today still operate on versions of British common law. Court structures, legal principles, the very idea of how justice is applied, that framework. Exported governance, parliaments, elections, civil services. Entire political systems across the world were shaped, directly or indirectly, by British models. Even the idea of how a modern state functions in many places traces back to British rule. And then there's culture: cricket, football, rugby. These weren't just games people picked up for fun. They were introduced, institutionalized, and then embraced. Now they're part of national identities across continents. So even though the empire itself is gone, its imprint everywhere. But here's the part that doesn't get packaged as neatly. Legacy isn't always positive. Because alongside infrastructure and systems, there was exploitation. Resources extracted at massive scale. Local industries disrupted or completely dismantled. Economies redesigned to serve Britain's needs, not the people living there. And then, borders. Lines drawn on maps with little understanding of cultures, tribes, or histories on the ground. Those decisions, they didn't just fade away. Some of the conflicts we see today, some of the instability, the tension, the divisions, they trace back to that era. That's the uncomfortable side of empire. The part that doesn't always make it into the highlight reel. But it matters, because history isn't just about what was built, it's about what was left behind. And then there's Britain itself. Because losing the empire, that wasn't just political, it was personal. For centuries, Britain saw itself as the center of the world, the decision maker, the power broker, the empire. And then suddenly, that identity had to change. From global ruler to one nation among many. Still influential, still relevant, but no longer dominant. And that shift, it wasn't smooth. It required a complete reset economically, politically, psychologically. And yet, when you step back and look at the full scale of it all, it's almost hard to believe. A relatively small island nation, with limited natural resources, managing to control territories across every inhabited continent. That doesn't happen by luck. That takes strategy, timing, technological advantage, and yes, at times, ruthless decision-making. Because empires aren't built on ideals, they're built on power. And Britain understood that game, played it, refined it, mastered it. But like every empire before it, Rome, the Ottomans, the Mongols, it hit the same wall. Expansion turned into overextension. Control became too expensive. Resistance became too strong. And once that process starts, decline isn't optional, it's inevitable. So what's the takeaway? Maybe it's this: power doesn't last. Influence evolves, and history, it keeps moving. The British Empire didn't just shape the past. It shaped the world you're living in right now. The language you're hearing, the systems running nations, the connections linking continents together. All of it somehow traces back to that rainy island that once decided survival wasn't enough. It wanted control, and for a moment in time it had it, but not forever, never forever. But let's zoom out for a second, because if you really want to understand the British Empire, you can't just study what it became. You have to understand what it felt like to live inside it. Picture this. You're in London, late 1800s, the center of gravity for the most powerful empire on Earth. Ships are docking non-stop, day after day, carrying pieces of the world into one city. Tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from Egypt. The ports are alive, the streets are electric, money is moving, industry is exploding. To the average person in Britain, this doesn't feel like domination. It feels like momentum, like progress, like opportunity. Like the world is opening up and Britain is leading the charge. Now flip it. Same time, same empire, but you're in India or Kenya or Jamaica. And suddenly the story changes. Because for millions living under British rule, this wasn't opportunity. It was control. Decisions made thousands of miles away. Resources pulled out of the land. Local systems reshaped or replaced entirely. Cultures pressured. Voices limited. Priorities decided elsewhere. Same empire, completely different experience. And that contrast, that's the core of this entire story. Because the British Empire wasn't one thing. It was layered. It created wealth and inequality at the same time. It connected continents while dividing communities. It imposed order and triggered resistance. All of it happening simultaneously. And that's exactly why, even today, people still debate it. Was it a force for globalization? Or a system of exploitation? The real answer, it was both. And that tension, that duality, is what makes it so powerful and so controversial. Now here's something a lot of people miss. The empire didn't just reshape the world. The world reshaped Britain, in a big way. Especially after World War II, as people from across the former empire began moving to Britain, they didn't just arrive. They brought everything with them. Languages, traditions, food, music, different ways of seeing the world. And suddenly, Britain wasn't just exporting culture anymore. It was absorbing it, evolving. becoming more diverse, more layered, more global than ever before. So in a strange way, even after the empire faded, its story didn't end. It changed form, from control to connection. And maybe that's the final twist in all of this. Because the British Empire didn't just leave behind borders or institutions. It left behind relationships, complicated ones, sometimes painful, sometimes powerful, but real, and still shaping how countries interact, how cultures blend, how identities form, even today. So when you hear the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," understand what that really meant. It wasn't just geography. It was reach, influence, impact, a scale of power that's hard to fully grasp now, but also a reminder, because no matter how big something becomes, no matter how unstoppable it looks, time catches up. Every time, empires rise, empires fall, and what they leave behind, that's what lasts, that's what we're still living through, right now.